We're looking at the book of Micah, and God is warning Judah about judgment through Micah. And for a lot of people, as they're listening, they're not really liking what Micah has to say, obviously. And to them, it probably sounds a lot like treason, because Micah's going to be talking about the Davidic king. And he's saying that it's over for him. And so as Micah's crying and as he's preaching, a crowd is going to start gathering, and they're going to be asking Micah, why is this judgment coming? Why are you saying these things? And to answer them, Micah begins pronouncing a woe, and he starts with the elite. This is chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And what does he say the elite are doing? He says, "Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. When morning comes, they do it, for it's in the power of their hands. They covet fields and then seize them, and houses and take them away. They rob a man in his house, a man in his inheritance." And this is significant, because you remember, God had made some big promises to Abraham: land, seed, and blessing. And so land was a big deal to Israel. For one, it gave them status as a nation. For another, it was a reminder that God keeps his promises. God told Abraham they were going to have land, they have land. Therefore, Israel was to prize that blessing. That was to be a big deal to them. That was to be one of the ways that they remembered how good God had been to them, that this was a gift from God, and they were to steward that land for God's glory. And part of the job of a king was to protect the inheritance of the people. A king was supposed to make sure that everybody got the land they were supposed to have. And that's part of why Moses established the year of Jubilee. Every Israelite had to have a stake in the land, and the king was supposed to protect that stake. But instead, what are they doing? They are stealing the people's land so the people don't have an inheritance. And Micah's saying, you violated God's plan. And as a result, God is issuing a massive decree. Micah writes in verse 3, "I'm planning against this family a calamity from which you can't remove your necks." In other words, you are going to die. You're not going to get out of being executed. And in verse 4, "This will be the lament that they will say for you." Actually, he says this will be the taunt. What's a taunt? When you taunt someone, you are mocking them. And he's saying they're going to mock you, and you're going to moan bitterly. And the word for moan apparently sounds like na na na. And so people are going to look at the leadership of Israel and humiliate them. And they're going to be saying, we are utterly ruined. And so it's like they're mimicking what the leadership is saying, mocking them. And so, again, he's coming back to the land issue. God's going to remove the land from the person who stole it, and he's going to give the field to someone else, to an apostate. And the result in verse 5 is that you will have none to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. They think they've got this field, but God says you're not going to enjoy that field. Instead of them being the one who has the line to measure things out, they won't get that opportunity. God will cut them off from the opportunity to be part of his people. In verse 6, he identifies a second problem. So they're not doing their job to protect the blessing of the land, and as a result, the land's going to be taken away from them. What are they doing according to verse 6? "Do not speak out," so they speak. The king was supposed to write down the law so that they would have a copy, so that he would have a copy for himself, and so that he would remember it. They were supposed to meditate on the law. The leaders weren't supposed to be the ones who suppressed the truth, but ones who protected the truth, preserved the truth. But they don't. Instead, they tell the prophet, stop speaking God's word. They say God's patience, and God's patience is unlimited. But what does God say to them at the end of verse 7? "Is it being said, O house of Jacob, is the spirit of the Lord impatient? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to the one walking uprightly?" In other words, you think you have my patience. You're saying, stop talking to us about this because God's so patient, but you don't have my patience. You're not my friend. You're my enemy. And to prove that, he exposes how they treat people. They strip off the robes of peaceful people. They abuse widows and orphans. And on top of all that sin, they refuse to listen to God's rebuke. What kind of preacher do they want, according to verse 11? Micah says, "If a man walking after wind and falsehood had told lies and said, 'I will speak out to you concerning wine and liquor,' he would be the spokesman of this people." Talk to us about drink. That's the kind of preacher we want. And so God comes to them in verses 12 and 13. The Davidic king has failed, and so God says he's going to take over as king. The human shepherd has failed, so God's going to become the shepherd once again. Yahweh is the good shepherd. God will take care of Israel. When all the shepherds fail, he comes in to shepherd his people and save the day. That's what makes him a good king. God's contrasting the way he rules with the Davidic kings. And that's really Israel's only hope, is that God will be faithful to his promises to his people. And after pointing them to their only hope, Micah comes back in chapter 3 to talk to the leadership once again. The leadership, the human leadership has failed. Look to God. Now, let me show you again how badly the human leaders have failed. Verses 2 and 3, what are the rulers doing? You who hate good and love evil, who tear off their skin from them and their flesh from their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, strip off their skin from them, break their bones, and chop them up as for the pot and as meat in a kettle. The human leaders of Israel are ruthlessly abusing the very ones they are meant to lead and protect. In verses 5 to 7, he talks to the prophets, and what are the prophets doing, and what is God going to do as a result? Thus says the Lord concerning the prophets who lead my people astray. When they have something to bite with their teeth, they cry peace, but against him who puts nothing in their mouths, they declare holy war. In other words, these prophets, they just prophesy for money. They say what the person wants them to say. If you have money, they'll say nice things. If you don't have money to give them, they'll prophesy bad things. These are not the kinds of prophets that actually speak for God or that God's people need. Then in verses 9 through 12, Micah comes back to the leadership and specifically the way they had ruined God's capital cities. How were they trying to build God's city? They are building Zion with bloodshed, he says. And what's motivating the judges, the priests, and the prophets? Money. In spite of all this sin and greed, what were they saying? This is what's so crazy. Micah's just exposing them for who they are. And yet, what are they saying? They're saying, is not the Lord in our midst? Calamity will not come upon us. What does that tell you about people? It tells us that we're so easily blinded to the state of our relationship with God. Essentially, Micah is looking at those who are leading God's people and saying, you think you can build up Jerusalem with all this sin? You wanted Jerusalem to be this great capital, but you're going about it the wrong way. The symbol of Davidic power was supposed to be Jerusalem, but what's going to happen to Jerusalem? It's going to be a heap of ruins. And as we turn from chapter 3 to chapter 4, it kind of feels like it's all over, honestly. Israel's doomed. The Davidic covenant's over. The world is doomed. It's all over. Then God shifts, but it's not all over. Surprise. Yes, it is over for a season, but it's not over forever. It's suspended. There will be a fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. And what's going to happen according to chapter 4, verses 1 through 4? He says, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. Sounds like Isaiah. And it shall be lifted up above the hills, and people shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. What? That's such a surprise after the first 3 chapters. And we see here everything starting to reverse. Yahweh's teaching Israel. Yahweh's teaching the nations. Yahweh is judging. Yahweh is proclaiming his word from Jerusalem. In other words, Yahweh is king over Jerusalem, and the world is transformed. Therefore, verse 5, Micah says, because this is your hope, what should you do? Though all the peoples walk each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever. Go back to God. Be faithful to God. Who are going to be God's people in verses 6 and 7? In that day declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcast, even those whom I have afflicted. I will make the lame a remnant and the outcast a strong nation. Makes you wonder if Jesus didn't get that when he said some of his parables about those banquets God was going to host. He's going to look for the outcasts. He's going to make them his kingdom. And what's he going to do with them according to the end of verse 7 and verse 8? And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from now on and forever. And so this knowledge should give them strength, God's real people, to go through the judgment that was coming. And in verses 9 and 10, Micah said God's going to send them into exile, but eventually he's going to rescue them. And it's like he's comforting the true believers here. What's coming is hard, but you have to go through it if you're going to get to God's amazing future plan that he has for you. And what are the nations going to think has happened? According to verse 11, they've been assembled against Judah. They think it's over for Judah. But what are they missing according to verse 12? They do not know the thoughts of the Lord, and they do not understand his purpose. The world is going to get this wrong. It looks like God's abandoned, or he's just judged Israel, his people, and they're just gone. But that's not how it's going to end. And what is God's ultimate plan according to verse 13? Arise and thresh, daughter of Zion, for your horn I will make iron, and your hoofs I will make bronze, that you may pulverize many peoples, that you may devote to the Lord their unjust gain, and their wealth to the Lord of all the earth. So God's going to reverse everything. But how? How is God going to do this? Micah begins to tell us in chapter 5. And basically what he says is, before God's going to resurrect his people, they have to die. And what is the death blow? First, you got the exile. Then second, the end of the Davidic king. What do the nations do in verse 1 of chapter 5? They smite the judge of Israel. Now, judge, he's a judge here instead of a king, and that's really Zedekiah. Zedekiah is not in the line of kings. God's people are going to be humiliated to the point where they don't even have a king on the throne, and the person who's leading them then is going to be defeated. And that's a problem for a lot of reasons, but there's hope. And where's that hope going to begin according to verse 2? But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah. This is where hope begins. And how does he describe the city here? What does he say is going to come from her? And what exactly does he say about the person who's going to come from her? He says, Bethlehem, you're too little to be among the clans of Judah. So you're just small and insignificant. But from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Wow. The ruler of Israel is going to come from Bethlehem, and he's going to be a unique person. His going forth are from long ago. Now, why do you think it's important he's born in this particular city, in Bethlehem? David. Of course, that's where David is from. And so you see in chapter 4, Micah described the fall of Israel and the collapse of the Davidic dynasty. And so what's happening in chapter 5 is a start over. Let's go. Let's do it again. And we're going back to where it all started. And God says, this is how Israel's going to raise from the dead. It's going to begin where it began the first time. And that's in Bethlehem with a new Davidic king. And we're going to look at what God promises to do through this great Davidic king in the next video.